Hello, good day everyone. Welcome to the last webinar of our series. I am Laura Cabrera. I'm a past chair of the Emerging Issues Task Force of the International Neuroethics Society, now chaired by my colleague Nicole Martinez, who you probably met in previous webinars. The task force is an interdisciplinary and international team of researchers committed to bringing attention to important neuroethical issues of interest to members of the society as well as the general public. My other fellow members include Dr. Adrian Carter, Ishan Gupta, Philip Kellmeyer, Carola Kreitmeyer, and Anthony Weiss. As I mentioned, this webinar is the last one of our series of webinars put by the Emerging Issues Task Force to engage a broader audience with emerging and cutting-edge topics within neuroethics. Today, the topic of our webinar is environmental neuroethics, a topic close to me as I was involved in its inception while a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Judy Ellis at Neuroethics Canada. A series of events has made clear the importance of the intersection of environment, brain, and mental health. And so this has really catalyzed the importance of this area within neuroethics. And today our hope is to introduce this relevant area for all of you, or to also elicit questions as how to go forward. For that, we have Dr. Judy Ellis. She will be our moderator. We also have, she's professor of neurology and Canada researcher in neuroethics at the University of British Columbia and director of Neuroethics Canada. And more importantly, for our topic today, Dr. Ellis pioneered this research area. In terms of panelists, we will have Dr. Caleb Finch, who is professor at the USC Davis School of Gerontology, and William Kirschnick, chair in the neurobiology of aging. And his talk is going to focus on environmental effects in the brain. Then we also have Louis Harley, who is a master's student at Neuroethics Canada, recently awarded the Maurice Young Center for Applied Ethics Graduate Fellowship. We have Dr. Thomas Albright, who is professor and director of the Vision Center Laboratory at the Salk Institute for Biological Studies, and Conrad Previs Chair in Vision Research. And then myself, Associate Professor of Neuroethics at Pennsylvania State University, and Dorothy Fairhog and J. Lloyd Hogg, Chair in Neuroethics. So with that, I'll let our moderator to kick us off for this event.
Good day, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm just so grateful to the Emerging Issues Task Force of the International Neuroethics Society for giving us a chance to talk about environmental neuroethics today. As a past president of the society, it's very exciting to see new topics always emerging in our field and to bring them to you in fulsome discussion through webinars like this. I want to thank Laura Cabrera, Millie Hang in my center at the University of British Columbia, Robert Beats, the INS overall, and Nicole Martinez, who's now chair of the Emerging Issues Task Force, for enabling this webinar and for all of you for joining us. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently located in British Columbia, Canada, and I have the privilege to live and work and thrive on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Lillooet First Nations people. And I'm deeply grateful for the opportunity to be able to be here with you on these beautiful lands. As we go into the webinar, we're going to invite everyone to post their comments and questions during the presentations. We're going to have all 4 presentations at once, but please don't hesitate to start posting your questions and comments right away. And we will take them as soon as the presentations are over. So where did this concept of environmental neuroethics begin? Well, it began around 2013, first published in 2014 in the Journal of Law and Biosciences in a publication that Professor Ralph Matthews in the Department of Sociology at the University of British Columbia and I started to conceptualize. And I hope that Professor Matthews is on with us this morning and will participate in the conversation with us when we open it up to all. What were we thinking about? We were thinking that environmental neuroethics situates the field of neuroethics at the intersection of really some of the leading transformatory processes of our time. We were recognizing that the world is experiencing sweeping changes today in ecology and society, and these changes were arising from a really continually expanding worldwide human demand for energy and new products and a technologically advanced lifestyle. And of course, neurotechnologies have always been a great focus for us in neuroethics. The changes are largely caused by human behavior, but also by natural phenomenon that occur in our environment. We proposed this as a topic for the then President Obama's Presidential Commission. We didn't have a lot of uptake at the time. And perhaps this is an example of where sometimes ideas, thoughts, concepts come up in neuroethics and elsewhere, and they have to find their moment. And it appears that now is the moment. We've seen activity in this area in the National Academy of Medicine and today through the Neuroethics Society. So what are we talking about? Lara and I published a paper in 2016 that really defines environmental neuroethics, or frames it in 5 categories: brain science and the environment. And that's really the way that society and people adapt to changes to environmental opportunities and threats. The relational self, how do we interact with our changes in the environment, and how does it impact our mental health? Cross-cultural factors, traditional knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and how does knowledge that is not from Western societies, as neuroethics is often situated, really impact our understanding of brain and mind well-being, as well as changes through disorders of our neurologic and psychiatric conditions. Our 4th pillar for environmental neuroethics was social policy. How do we encourage, as neuroethicists and scientists and scholars, work together with our social organizations to respond to changes in the environment as they affect people, communities, and society? And finally, the 5th pillar is around public discourse, the engagement and the importance of disciplines like ours to interact in a multi-directional way to exchange knowledge and information and share in our experiences to advance environmental change and the changes on people in a very beneficial and positive way. So with that introduction, it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Cabrera, I believe, who will go first to present on mental health, and then we will go over to the next speaker after that. Lara, over to you, please.
We have a slight change of plans, so we get first Dr. Finch, and then I'll go.
All right. Thank you, Lara. Caleb Finch, please join us, and I'm so glad you could be here with us today. We're honored to have you. Please go ahead.
Well, glad to join this outstanding group of discussants. I'm work on how the environment alters mental health from gestation through old age, and in particular, how air pollution influences the risks of cognitive decline and dementia. And I developed this in the context of socioeconomic differences in a larger framework that I call the neuroexposome, which I'll say more about in a moment. The first slide really makes the main point. And this is just published last week, an analysis of the health retirement population in the US for cognitive function in relationship to air pollution and education level. So the graph here from Jennifer Ailshire, my colleague at USC, shows on the horizontal axis the average levels of air pollution particles density per cubic meter, and on the y-axis, the probability of cognitive impairment. And what you see is that the top curve with less than 8 years of education has a approximately linear deficit in relationship to the density of air pollution particles, whereas the bottom dark line of people with high school or more education shows lower risk even at the highest levels. And this is a statement, a very powerful set of data that allows the statement that people with lower education have an environmental hazard that is much greater for outcomes of healthy brain aging than those with higher education. And my laboratory is trying to understand the basis for this using human epidemiological data and mouse models. The next slide shows a diagram of what we call the neuroexposome, or the Alzheimer's exposome, which identifies external and internal factors that alter brain health during aging. So at the very top, the exogenous components of the neuroexposome are air pollution and socioeconomic status, which affect everybody in the population, and then individual factors, diet, exercise, infections, traumatic brain injury, and then those funnel into endogenous factors in the neuroexposome. And one of the most important are our gut biomes, our fat deposits, hypertension, and those in turn influence the brain. And all of these are influenced by genetic variation, environment, interacting with the environment, E, over time, where time now extends at least 2 generations for exposure to air pollution, represented by gestational exposure to air pollution and other toxins with the impact on DNA methylation of the offspring. So we really have to have a multi-generational perspective on this. The next slide identifies classes of environmental factors that we consider gerogens, that shorten life expectancy and accelerate aging of heart and brain. And exogenous gerogens are low education, high exposure to air pollution, and cigarettes. Even though cigarettes are now only smoked by maybe 10 or 15% of North American populations, 40% of children in Canada and the United States are exposed to household adults' cigarette smoke. So these are inhaled toxins that have major impact on our health, including body fat, our blood lipids, and blood glucose. So I'd like then to take up the example of the apolipoprotein E genes, which are the most famous is the ApoE4 gene that's a risk factor for heart disease and for Alzheimer's disease. And here from a study in Columbia University in Manhattan is documentation that cognitive decline is greater in relation to air pollution for those who are carrying the ApoE4 allele, on the blue curve versus no ApoE4, which is the red curve. So here's one of several powerful documentations that carriers of the Alzheimer and heart disease risk gene ApoE4 have a greater vulnerability in exposure to air pollution. The next slide is some experimental data from our lab in a mouse that has an Alzheimer's gene that shows exposure to air pollution in black leads to more brain amyloid by 2 criteria. So we have mouse models that we can bring into this discussion. And my last slide takes this down to the level of gene expression, in which we've recently defined classes of genes that are involved in toxic response pathways that differ by male and female and differ by ApoE. So we have the beginnings of a theoretical structure for knowing how urban air pollution interacts with the human body through pathways that are well recognized in molecular biology, involving NF-kappa B and NRF2 transcription factor activation. And my last slide says that the future of healthy brain aging, in this lovely photo from the Vigeland Sculpture Garden in Oslo, has to do with optimizing gene-environment interaction across SES to minimize the effect of gerogens development through aging, whether those gerogens are tobacco smoke, air pollution, or unhealthy lifestyle of high fat, high sugar, high salt, and insufficient exercise. I'd be happy to have questions. I think I spoke for 7 minutes.
Caleb, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. I know I have burning questions already. I imagine others do as well. We're going to keep the questions for the open Q&A after everyone presents. I'm going to invite the participants to please start putting your questions into the Q&A box while we transition to Laura Cabrera. Laura, over to you.
All right, thank you. That was an excellent way to set us up into how these interactions are really important. So now, beyond neurological effects, as those discussed by Dr. Finch, environmental exposures also affect behavioral and mental health outcomes, including interfering with the capacity to cope with normal stresses of life, work productively, and make contributions to community life. Here's something that I want to stress is that by environment, I'm intentionally taking a broad definition, considering that the term has diverse meanings, especially in different fields like environmental health research or mental health research. And so the definition that I take is one that encompasses one's surroundings, including both natural and human-made, and as well as chemical, biological, physical in nature, and even social surroundings. Now, for those that are interested into more information on this, I don't have a lab that has data in the way that Dr. Finch presented, but I do want to point people to the National Academies of Science reports they recently published from 2 workshops that really delve into the intersection of these environmental exposures, both for neurological health and mental health. Now, let me go through my slides. So there are thousands of natural and synthetic chemicals that we know with neurotoxic activity that have been implicated in human psychiatric disorders and psychological functions. So we know best examples have heavy metals, in particular lead, solvents, and pesticides, which are, as I said, one of the best studied classes of neurotoxicant exposures. And both can result, all of these can result in subtle and lasting mental health consequences. For example, we know that adults occupationally exposed to metals, particularly lead, have long been known to demonstrate alterations in mood, energy, and irritability. Exposure to pesticides, in particular organophosphates, has been linked to increases in depression symptomatology, anxiety, and depression diagnosis. As Dr. Finch was mentioning, air pollutants has not only effects on cognition, on risk to increase Alzheimer, but they've also been linked to risk of autism and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, depression, anxiety, and schizophrenia. Now, the impact of these neurotoxicants depends not only on the level of exposure, but also on whether the exposures are acute or chronic, and whether the individuals exposed are at the certain vulnerable windows in the lifespans. So, for example, that we know that elderly populations as well as children have greater risks of the impact of these neurotoxicant exposures. And another population that sometimes we don't tend to consider as much is that even babies developing in utero also have great impact from these exposures from the pregnant women. There are also exposures that are not neurotoxicant in the same sense, in the same kind of physical or chemical sense, but they are both natural and human-caused environmental disasters. And we know that these type of disasters increases the risk of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, general anxiety, and substance use, which are often occurring in affected individuals. So, for example, if we think of the recent case like Flint, we know that the exposures were both neurotoxicants in the case of the lead in the water. But there were also exposures related to things that the disaster aggravated, like the environmental injustices presented in the disaster areas, which make clear the unfair distribution of harms and burdens across different populations. Now, not everything is all negative. Of course, one of the nice things that we know about these interactions between environment and mental health is that environmental factors can also improve mental health. So we have studies, animal studies, that show that enriched environment increase the range and number of normal behaviors that animals present, as well as reduce the frequency of anomalous behaviors. And more recently, there's studies in humans showing that exposure to natural areas in urban settings improve mental health. So, for example, there's a multi-decade nationwide study in Denmark that found of the disorder in adulthood than their peers raised in less greener settings, regardless of other assessed risk factors such as level of urbanization, socioeconomic factors, parental history of mental illness. There's also large nationwide surveys that have shown that self-reported mental health improves with every hour of contact with natural setting each week. So now, what are some of the neuroethical implications that I think the field of environmental neuroethics should really be paying attention? So one, as with the evidence put forward by Dr. Finch and some of the evidence that I presented, we know that these interactions can have both negative and positive impacts on human brain and mental health. We know that these have disproportionate or differential effects in different populations. And particularly, we're talking about, in the case of children, that this could really have impacts to future generations that we're still just seeing. And finally, the aspect of social justice, right? Like, we know that, as the evidence of Dr. Finch mentioned, like if you have less education, you have greater risk, or if you live in a poorer area, you have greater risk of being exposed to certain neurotoxicants. So I think this is a nice area for neuroethicists to really delve into the social justice issues. And then, of course, there is the question of, do we have a right to a healthy environment? That I think we need to start fleshing out more in terms of what do we even mean with, what is a healthy environment, and how can we use the evidence that we have to create environments that are supportive of our mental and neurological health. And so with that, I pass it to our next speaker.
Louise Harding from the University of British Columbia. Thanks for joining us. We'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I'm going to be speaking without slides. So I'm Louise Harding. I'm a trainee at Neuroethics Canada with Dr. Judy Ellis. So I'm pleased to speak today from my perspective on environmental neuroethics from the early career vantage point. I'm a master's student in population and public health, and my undergraduate training was in neuroscience and Indigenous studies. So I'll preface my couple-minute talk by stating that I'm in the camp that believes neuroethics and bioethics should be putting much more focus and resources into questions around social justice. I appreciate the two previous presenters on speaking to to these topics, and I think that really illustrates the potential for environmental neuroethics to contribute to in neuroethics social justice work. So whether that's decolonization, anti-racism, or migration. So I'm going to use these couple minutes to speak on how these topics can be examined through this new field of environmental neuroethics, potentially, starting by speaking briefly on some of my research, and then we'll suggest some specific topics and areas where I think environmental neuroethics could contribute to and expand on this. I'll acknowledge also the traditional territories that I'm residing on, which are the unceded ancestral traditional territories of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. And I'm a second generation born Canadian settler. And I use the term settler because it references the active nature of settler colonialism in Canada and my positionality and responsibility in approaching the topics that I'm going to talk about. I'd also like to acknowledge some news of a serious nature that in the last few weeks, the unmarked graves of 215 children were found at a former residential school site here in British Columbia in Kamloops. And this has spurred further inquiries into additional residential school sites where additional graves have been found. And two reasons this is important for me to bring up is because one is it's bringing the truth out about the genocide that has occurred through residential schools and colonization. And secondly, the very fact that it's been kept secret for so long exemplifies the ongoing nature of colonization. So these same systems are responsible for perpetuating violence of multiple forms today, including anti-Blackness and other forms of racism and ableism and so on. So how does this translate to neuroethics research? One way is through this larger ethics theme of justice. So we've seen some great work within the International Neuroethics Society recently around this topic, especially starting last year, including the formation of the Diversity and Equity Inclusion Task Force. And the fall annual meeting, as many of you know, is themed around social justice, which I'm really looking forward to. My own work with Dr. Illes follows on a number of studies from the United States that highlight a neurotechnology access gap for African Americans. In the past year, our team, including neurosurgery collaborators, Dr. Patrick McDonald and Dr. Chris Honey, conducted a mixed method study to examine equity and cultural meaningfulness surrounding advanced neurotechnologies, such as deep brain stimulation for diverse populations. In that study, we interviewed 22 physicians and nurses who have functional neurosurgery in their clinical toolboxes, primarily from across Canada. And justice was one of the themes that was discussed by a majority of the interviewees. Several spoke to how racism in our healthcare system may impede access and decision-making. And from the rating scale portion of the consultations, we also saw a geographical access gap for people living in rural and remote areas. So my thesis work builds on this, as I'll be working with Dr. Illes alongside co-PI Dr. Malcolm King, an Indigenous health researcher at the University of Saskatchewan, to set up a small working group of Indigenous knowledge holders and healthcare practitioners to discuss meanings and priorities in brain health and mental wellness, including interventions to the brain. So to shift gears back to environmental neuroethics, this field, I think, can really make use of these resources and knowledge that neuroethicists have been creating around social justice, especially recently, and build on this work in a really meaningful and actionable way. So, for example, Dr. Finch mentioned the impact of socioeconomic status on brain health, which refers to the impact of systematic oppression on the brain. So environmental neuroethics needs to be a neuroethics of diversity. And I think one great step to get this field going would be to invite Indigenous scholars to speak about what environmental neuroethics could mean to them and their communities, and to guide the work in a direction that will be useful. Because in Canada, Indigenous peoples are the front lines of environmental activism. Especially we've seen in the media in Canada and the USA many pipeline protests. So environmental neuroethics is also highly political. And lastly, environmental neuroethics will need to be action focused because of the urgency of climate change. So these community engaged, pragmatic and policy oriented approaches will be useful to apply here. That's what I've prepared to speak about today. And I look forward to hearing from Dr. Albright and the Q&A.
Thank you, Louise. It's no wonder that you are an award-winning International Neuroethics Society Young Investigator. That presentation was beautiful, and I'm sure everyone will have a lot of questions for you, myself included. For now, we'll go over to Tom Albright for the final presentation on environmental neuroethics from his point of view. Thanks for being here, Tom.
Thank you, Judy. And I'm delighted to be here for this presentation. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in. So I'm a neuroscientist, a practicing neuroscientist. I've been on the faculty of the Salk Institute for Biological Studies for the past 35 years. The Salk Institute was founded by Jonas Salk, who was, of course, the inventor of the polio vaccine in the 1950s. And it's a private biomedical research institution that is world-class. And we have a strong program in neuroscience there. So I run a lab in which we study the brain bases of visual perception, visual memory, and visually guided behavior. And I have for many years been concerned about the role of context in visual processing. That is, how do the other things that happen to be present in your visual field influence the way you process a particular feature in your visual field? How does your prior history affect the way you process visual information? And so again, we've done a lot of work on how the brain processes that kind of information. And a number of years ago, I got interested in the problem of architecture. And I should say at the outset that I have no formal training in architecture. I'm not an architect. I like to think that I'm a designer in some sense, in the same sense that most scientists are designers. But architecture, the details of architecture require me to collaborate with good architects. And I am part of an organization that's based in San Diego called the Academy of Neuroscience for Architecture, which has been in existence for about 20 years now. And it's composed of a number of very progressive architects and top neuroscientists. San Diego is sort of the center of the universe when it comes to neuroscience. And in terms of the quality and diversity of the program, and I'm not an unbiased observer, I have to say. But it's been a real pleasure working with architects and trying to understand how neuroscience can inform architecture. Now, when I mention neuroscience and architecture in the same sentence, I often get puzzled expressions from people. Why does neuroscience have anything to do with architecture? And the simple answer is outlined in the first slide here. The design, production, use, and appreciation of, and engagement with works of architecture necessarily rely upon human sensation, cognition, and behavior. That's self-evident and indisputable. Sensation, cognition, and behavior are products of the brain. And so to the extent that we can understand the brain, we may be able to come up with design principles that optimize the way we interact with works of architecture and design principles that affect the way we live, because we live in design spaces. Now, can I go to the next slide here? Yeah. So this is just a fairly obvious statement here. Architecture has always bowed to biology. We build buildings for people. Or most of the buildings we build are for people, and there are constraints, biological constraints that are built in. This is implicit for the most part. An architect will deal with a number of design considerations for a given project. There's budget, there is the site, there are issues of sustainability, materials, and so forth. But one thing that's always present and rarely acknowledged is that we're actually building for people. We're building for biological creatures who have needs. And so these are some of the things that we do when we build stuff. We create illumination sufficient for tasks. We adjust the rise-run ratio of stairs so we can climb them, and so on. And again, these are sort of trivial examples. They're more elaborate ways in which we accommodate people. One of my favorites is the door handle. I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, where most of the doors in homes are round doorknobs. And I moved to California 35 years ago, and I discovered that most of the doorknobs here are actually handles. And I was curious why this was true. And it turns out that California was on the cutting edge when it came to accommodations for people with disabilities. And that door handle is, from a biomechanical point of view, a much easier way to open a door. And so this is, again, it's design accommodating the needs of biological creatures, which we are. Now, you can extend that argument and say, well, architecture and design should accommodate the needs of the human brain. What are those needs of the human brain? Well, that's what we learned from the study of neuroscience. And I will talk today about what we know about the visual system, because that's a system that I work on, but there are a number of different areas of neuroscience that are relevant to this issue. Can I go to the next slide, please? So, and then in a moment, I'll speak about the specifics of an experiment that was built upon our knowledge of how the visual system works. But these are just applications of this knowledge of how neuroscience can inform architecture. There are needs, and this is directly to the point of this symposium. There are needs that we have in different environments in order to optimize our performance as biological creatures. And one of the most obvious of those is the learning environment. We want to create learning environments that create the smartest children. We want to create hospitals that optimize healing in the case of disease or injury. We want to create environments that optimize performance in the workplace, environments in which we can create, our imagination and our creativity are free to explore the possibilities. And finally, we want to create environments that enable us to put it simply, to calm down, to contemplate, to develop some sort of peace with the world. And so what do we know about the brain that can help us achieve these goals? Again, I'm going to speak about a particular application, and that has to do with learning environments. Could I have the next slide, please? This is an experiment that I did together with these people here. Jim Detterman was really the team leader on this. Jim Detterman is an architect in Baltimore with Craig Galden Davis. It's an architectural firm. Paul Archibald is a social scientist, and on the far right there is Bill Browning, who is the head of Terrapin Bright Green Architecture, and which again is an architectural firm, and is a big advocate of biophilic design. And I'll come to biophilic design in a moment. Now, as I said, this project was rooted in certain things that we know about the brain, how the brain processes visual information. I don't have the time to go into all of those details, but the next slide sort of summarizes the basic principles. So I'm going to assert two things, and there's actually a large literature on both of these things. First of all, the visual environment, and that is both the natural environment and the built environment, has measurable statistics. That is, we can go out there and measure the properties of things in that environment as they're received by the visual system. We can measure the intensity, we can measure the angles of things, and so on. And some of those measurements are interesting and useful, and some of them are not meaningful at all. And then secondly, the brain has highly specific organizational properties for representing the statistics of the visual environment. So what your brain does is it extracts features. And again, there's a history of physiology of the nervous system that goes back 50 years now, 60 years, looking at how the neurons in your brain extract features of the visual environment. And one simple thing I'll tell you is that there are cells in your visual cortex. That's the part of your cerebral cortex that processes visual information. There are cells there that represent the orientations of contours in your visual field. You don't need to know more than that for the present time. There are lots of cells that represent lots of different orientations. And it turns out that those cells are connected to one another, not in a random way, but such that cells with similar orientations are connected together preferentially. We call them orientation preferences. That is the type of orientation that activates those cells. So these are like little filters for contours in your visual environment, and they're connected in this unique way. And that leads to certain predictions about, which is the hypothesis at the bottom here, the organizational and functional properties of the visual brain, that is the things I just told you, these orientation selective neurons facilitate the processing of statistical regularities in the visual environment. It turns out that continuous contours, contours that are not broken up by rapid changes in the angle of contours, are easier for us to see. There's a sort of visual simplicity, what I call a sense of order. That's taking a term that was actually first used by Ernst Gombrich, the great art historian, art theorist of the 20th century. So it gives you a sense of order, and there's a visual ease associated with that sense of order. And so it turns out that that's actually a good explanation, or a neuronal explanation, for the principles of biophilic design, because most biophilic design is composed of sort of gradual changes in orientation. And could I have the last slide? We did an experiment using these principles. The experiment was with the Green Street Academy. This is a charter school and middle school in Baltimore. And it took, I think, a couple of years to get permission to do the experiment, because the school system doesn't like scientists coming in and messing around with classrooms. But we did get, Jim Detterman did eventually get permission to do this. And we designed a classroom. It's not a very good picture of it, but on the upper right there is an illustration of the experimental classroom. And again, you can't see it very well, but there are patterns on the walls, on the ceiling, and on the floors that are designed in a way that taps into this native organization of the visual part of the brain. And these are also, again, consistent with biophilic design. And we asked two questions. How does this affect academic performance, and how does this affect stress levels? And the data on academic performance are shown on the lower left there. These are, and again, I can't even see it, but on my laptop. But you, if you look from time is going from left to right, and these are samples at 3 points in time. And these are iReady tests. And those of you who have small children in public schools know what these tests are. They're a standardized way of sampling academic performance, which is done on a regular schedule throughout the year. And so that everybody is given the same kind of test. And what you can see is that at the outset of the school year, the students in this experimental classroom, which is the one at the upper right there, and those in a control classroom, which I haven't illustrated here, but it's all of you who've been to public school know what this looks like. It's a little bit chaotic, and one of the additional problems is there's stuff all over the walls. It's a sort of a very chaotic visual environment. And so at the beginning of the year, academic performance is the same for these two groups. But as the year passes, the green bars, you can see, go up over time significantly faster than the gray bars. So everybody is learning over the course of the year, but the students in the experimental classroom are learning at a faster rate. A rate that's 3.3 times greater than the rate for the students in the control classroom. Now, this is a correlation, I should say, but our inference is this is causally related to stress levels. That is, we're reducing stress by presenting this very simplified visual environment that taps into the native organization of the visual system. And that's what's leading to an improvement in academic performance. So what's the evidence that we've actually reduced stress level? Well, what we wanted to do was look at cortisol levels in saliva, but the school system wouldn't let us do that. It's a human subjects issue. But we could measure heart rate variability. And it turns out that heart rate variability, your heart, this is really measuring the interval between heartbeats. And heart rate variability is correlated with stress, or inversely correlated with stress. That is, the more variability you have, notwithstanding getting into the sort of pathological state of too much variability, but the more variability you have, the less stress you're presumed to be in. And so this was a simple measure for us to quantify stress. And we did that over the course of the year. And here are, again, the gray bars are for the control classroom. The blue bars are for the experimental classroom, and you can see that heart rate variability is going up over the course of the year in a way that's consistent with our prediction. That is, that we've reduced stress for these students. So the general point here is that building upon neuroscience knowledge, we're able to intervene in a particular way that enhances performance. Again, we're inferring the cause to be a reduction of stress levels, and enhances performance in an academic environment. And ideally, we could extend these kinds of principles to other environments. I spoke about work environments and environments for healing and environments for contemplation. And there are an enormous number of applications of this kind of approach to improving people's lives. And thank you.
Tom, thank you so much. The range of topics under this environmental neuroethics umbrella is extraordinary. I just want to put a plug in while I invite all the speakers to come back online or on the phone to say that Anthony Clark, who is an architect in Australia, is preparing a volume for a series called Developments in Neuroethics and Bioethics on neuroarchitecture, and it is in preparation now. It should be out in about 9 to 12 months, and you can keep a lookout for that. So I really want to thank all the speakers for this in array, this travel through the landscape of environmental neuroethics. I think we've just touched the iceberg of what the possibilities are. Caleb Finch, are you on audio with us?
I am indeed.
Okay, very good. I'd like to pose a quick question to you and Tom Albright, and then I'm going to share a comment from Ralph Matthews, who's also with us. But I'm just wondering, for both Tom and Caleb, are there gender effects in your findings on exposure to pollution on the one hand, and in terms of thriving in environments that that reflect the way that we process visual information on the other hand? So Caleb, over to you first.
All right. Well, the gender is under a study, and there isn't right now a definitive answer. My hunch is that it's going to be differently presented at different sensitivities depending upon SES, which determines occupation and household exposure. There's a great deal of indoor air pollution influence on cognition during development and adult life and aging. That is not represented in the external measures that are available. So this is going to get more complex and more interesting, and further subcompartments by SES.
All right,
Open question.
Thank you very much. Indeed, one of my questions for everyone was going to be, where do we need to go next? And that already sets the stage for answering that question. Tom, how about in the classroom and workplace?
Let me just add one more thing
Sure.
to prime Tom on this. Indoor air pollution may also be an important architectural neuroscience question. Over and out to you, Tom.
So going back to the gender issue, this is a really interesting question. There's no evidence that I know of that gender affects low-level visual processing. That is the early processing of visual information. Simple things like color perception and sensitivity to contrast or motion or detection of shapes. But of course, over the course of one's lifetime, we've created societies that create different kinds of constraints for women and men, and that
exactly.
I would presume that has a big effect on what I would call visual cognition, the ability to process visual information, make decisions about it. And we haven't looked at this in the educational example that I showed you, but I think that there are lots of differences between people, some having to do with personality, some having to do with their personal history, that should be looked at. We have begun to, I did a project of a similar sort with a Alzheimer's care facility in Boston. And the goal there was to provide an environment. Typical Alzheimer care facilities are horrible in the sense that you have people who are already confused and you put them in an extremely confusing environment where everything looks the same. And so these were manipulations that were designed to sort of optimize their performance in that case. So that's a sort of a special case of people with particular needs, in which the environment is designed in a way to satisfy those needs in a better way.
Right.
And you could apply that in lots of different contexts.
Good, thank you, thank you, thank you. So we have exactly 10 minutes left in this webinar. I'm going to go on to a question and comment posted by one of the pioneers of environmental neuroethics, Professor Matthews at UBC. And before I offer his comments, let me just say that we have a truly international audience on this webinar today. We have people from the United States, Brazil, Uganda, Canada. That's the few I'm seeing in the chat and elsewhere. So we're just thrilled to have this kind of international global reach. It's wonderful. So a comment from Professor Matthews is he emphasizes the importance of biopolitics and neuroethics, and I invite anyone who wishes to speak to that to make a comment. But maybe specifically a question for Louise, if you're able to address this question. And the answer may be we're not ready yet, but it's something important to think about, which is what are the links between Indigenous understanding of the law and land, in particular as it relates to human health at all levels from genomes to community?
Yeah, I think that would be a great question to explore and to invite an Indigenous scholar to speak on from this area. And I think that would be the best way to, I think, catalyze this question and shape it based on community interest and what could be impactful. Because certainly there are differences in knowledge about the environment and so on, which could be really important to consider in environmental neuroethics. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for that answer, Louise. The Neuroethics Canada, based at UBC, holds regular community conversations virtually or in person with the public. We often have more than 300 registrants for our events, and we could definitely consider that one in moving forward. So thank you, Ralph, and thank you, Louise. The question for Lara Cabrera from Joyce Wamala. Could you please elaborate on some of the suggested impacts of the environment on the mental health of future generations? And if you could give some specific examples, that would be appreciated.
Sure. So as I mentioned in my presentation, we know that there are certain windows of development where certain populations are more a higher risk. So we know that children are one of those populations where, children have, they require lesser doses of a given neurotoxicant to have, same levels as an adult in terms of, the outcomes. So for example, in the case of pesticides, let's just think of, children playing a playground. And we know that in playgrounds or, for our grasses to look nice, we tend to use chemicals that we know have repercussions for children. And they tend to play more than adults in these environments. So what we're doing is we are creating environments where we are exposing our children for longer, more time. And that those effects accumulate. So those are the type of effects that I see for future generations, where we have these younger generations more exposed, or potentially some more exposed than others, and like we're truly starting just to study what is the impact of longitudinally follow children that have these larger exposures. So that's what I think that's the impact that I see for future generations, in addition to the effects that I mentioned in terms of we're not even considering babies that are in development in utero, right? Where those neurotoxicants are also very, they have higher risks in the pregnant women. So not just to the women, but it's to the babies that are in development. So again, how are we affecting this? We know that they're more likely to have less kind of cognitive achievements, we know that they might have more risk of developing developmental disorders. So those are the type of impacts that I think we should really be paying attention. How can we reduce, mitigate? And it's great to hear that, it's not all negative. We know that there are ways in which we can prevent and mitigate.
All right, thank you, Lara. We have 5 minutes left and 2 excellent questions on deck. So they're both for all of you. The first one is from Chloe, who asks, how do you envision the field of environmental neuroethics intersecting with the field of environmental ethics? What unique questions can neuroethics help answer? Tom, perhaps over to you first.
Well, so I think that the neuronal part of it is critical, because that's where we get the data on how to organize the environment. In as much, I mean, this is just a broad statement of the goals of this neuroscience and architecture initiative, but in as much as we know how the brain works, we can tap into that knowledge to build a better environment. I mean, good architects know how to do this. They have intuitions about how to optimize human behavior, but that's what architecture does. It shapes human behavior. And it shapes cognitive performance. And so the neuronal element of that, because behavior and cognition are controlled by the brain, the neuronal element of that is critical.
Thank you. Anyone else?
I would add that I think environmental neuroethics adds something really critical in terms of how the exposures are disproportionately burdening racialized populations, and helping us to understand how that is a system of oppression that continues to perpetuate disparities. When we're looking at things like cognitive decline and so on, how it impacts the lifespan. And Lara was speaking about children developing neurodevelopmental disabilities and so on. So I think looking at it from a brain perspective definitely adds a lot from the social justice perspective that I've been thinking about.
Wow. Very nice. Caleb, I can't see you, so I don't know if you want to weigh in, but please speak up if you'd like to address this question.
I've said enough on my own. Happy to respond to questions.
Okay, thank you. Lara, do you want to weigh in on this question? Interactions with environmental ethics, anything more to add?
Well, just to say that some of the questions are going to be very similar, but again, just to stress what Thomas and Luis were saying, that the neuro part is really the key different aspect, the focus of environmental neuroethics.
All right, thank you. So the last question that has many votes, and it's posed by our very own Roland Nadler, has to do with the role of industry and neuroethics. Since we established the society in 2016, both all of us in the society, and I think those of us working broadly in neuroethics, have really endeavored to engage with the private sector, the government sector, in open conversation about roles and responsibilities and ethical and morally guided ways of doing good work in terms of responsible innovation, discovery and clinical translation and commercialization. But as Roland points out in his question, industry has been a negative actor in many ways of the harmful effects of changes on the environment, climate, addictions, fossil fuels, and so forth. Would any of you, he asks, and our participants would like to hear your views, if what justice looks like when wrongdoing is both remote in time and location from ongoing harm, past and ongoing harm. Louise, I see you nodding. Could we ask you to go first?
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the systems that allow corporate actors that allow these things to happen. So neoliberal capitalism, which to consider how these systems continue and how we can change these systems going forward. So that's a political perspective on if we can change our approaches to how we treat each other and the environment, starting with our political values. That can be one way of at least moving away from those types of actions.
Right, thank you. So that also speaks to Professor Matthew's references to biopolitics. Robert, I'm going to ask you and Nicole to give us 2 more minutes before you close the webinar for us so everyone has a chance to weigh in? Anyone else? Caleb on the phone. Industry
I'm available.
actors. Do you have anything you want to say about industry actors?
No, I'm available for questions.
Okay, thank you. Lara, and then over to Tom for the final comment.
I think to me what comes to mind is accountability, right? Like I think we need to create better regulatory systems or better governance frameworks where we can really make these actors accountable for their actions, where people can really see, that people that are doing wrongdoing are accountable for this, but also that they are made, that they have to take action to address this wrongdoing. So we've seen some of these in cases, where the communities that were affected by oil spills or things like that, where sometimes, companies not only have to, pay to the communities, but also I think Louise mentioned in her talk, like we need to be activists as environmental neuroethicists to really speak to those communities that are affected and how they're affected. And so I think I'm not sure how justice is going to look, but I do have some hints of, the necessary ingredients needed to start taking action and making these actors accountable.
All right, Tom, last word, and then I'll wrap us up.
Well, the thing that keeps me awake at night is climate change. And so the big issue there is attribution of cause. And my understanding from people, I don't work in that area, but my understanding from people who do work in that area is that the spatial and temporal resolution of measurements of pollution are becoming better and better all the time. So the time will come when I presume we can know whether the paper plant that's down the road is actually the cause of sea level rise in my vicinity. And when we get to that point, then we have the route to justice. That is to say, this kind of information could be used in a court case is evidence of attribution and punishment then metered out in the appropriate way.
All right. Thank you. This conversation could go on for a whole other hour. There are many more questions. It's always good to leave wanting more. And I clearly think this group of panelists have left us with much to think about and much more to want to do in the area of environmental neuroethics. I want to close by recognizing the International Neuroethics Society's President Nita Farahani and incoming President Joseph Finns for leading a society that enables these kinds of conversations that are open, sometimes challenging, but very forward-looking. And I want to again thank our panelists and all of you for joining us today. And with that, we will conclude. Thanks everyone again.
Thank you.